Russia built its long-range bomber force around the idea that distance itself was a weapon. Engels, too, tucked deep inside Saratov Oblast, hundreds of kilometers from anything resembling a front line, was supposed to be the one asset Ukraine could never realistically touch. From its runways, Tu-95 MS and Tu-160 bombers have launched cruise missile after cruise missile at Ukrainian cities, always returning home to a base Moscow considered permanently out of reach. But in the last 96 hours, that assumption has gone up in a column of black smoke visible for kilometers across the Volga region. Engels, too, sits beside a city of roughly 200,000 people, and its runway apron has long been one of the most heavily photographed military sites in Russia by satellite trackers, simply because of what it holds: a meaningful share of Russia's entire operational strategic bomber fleet, parked wingtip to wingtip in the open. Independent open-source analysts monitoring recent satellite passes report visible damage consistent with fire and blast effects across at least part of the aircraft dispersal area, along with scorching near the base's fuel storage section. The cause was not an accidental fire in a fuel line. Ukrainian long-range strike drones, launched from multiple directions to overwhelm the base's air defense coverage, penetrated hundreds of kilometers into Russian airspace over a tightly compressed 96-hour window. According to reporting referenced by Ukrainian military channels and repeated across independent OSINT monitoring accounts, the base's Pantsir and short-range air defense systems, positioned primarily to intercept conventional cruise missile threats, appear to have struggled against the slower, harder-to-track drone profiles used in the attack. To understand how a base this deep inside Russia ended up burning, you have to look at the sequence Ukraine actually followed. The first wave targeted the aviation fuel depot feeding the base directly, igniting a fire that satellite thermal imagery reportedly showed still active more than a day later. The second wave, launched roughly 12 hours after the first, struck sections of the aircraft dispersal apron itself, an area where bombers have historically been parked without adequate hardened shelters. The third and final wave in the sequence targeted a radar and early warning installation on the base's perimeter, degrading the very system meant to provide advance notice of exactly this kind of attack. Each of these strikes alone would be a serious embarrassment. Together, they represent something closer to a controlled unraveling, with the fuel depot burning, the dispersal apron damaged, and the perimeter radar degraded. The base's ability to fly, refuel, and even see an incoming threat has been hit at nearly every link in the same short window. Regional Russian monitoring channels, cited by independent trackers, describe an unusual volume of military air traffic redirecting toward alternate bases further east in the days immediately following the strikes, a strong signal that commanders no longer consider Engels too fully safe to operate from at full capacity. This is where the deeper strategy becomes visible. Ukraine has never had the resources to defeat Russia's strategic bomber fleet in a single engagement, and nobody seriously expected it to. Ukrainian officials have instead been consistent about a different doctrine: make every basing option for these aircraft costly enough that the fleet's operational tempo slows, its readiness drops, and its crews spend more time relocating than flying missions. Engels, too, was supposed to be immune to that pressure by virtue of sheer distance. Instead, it has become the clearest proof yet that distance alone no longer guarantees safety for any Russian military asset. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War have noted that Ukraine's demonstrated ability to strike deep into Russian territory has steadily expanded the map of what Moscow can consider a secure rear base, shrinking it strike by strike rather than through any single decisive blow. Independent defense analysts tracking these long-range drone campaigns point out that the range demonstrated in this latest attack sequence represents one of the deepest confirmed penetrations of the war so far, closing a distance gap the Russian Air Force had treated as an article of faith for years. Russia's response so far has leaned heavily on dispersal rather than genuine and defense. Additional aircraft have reportedly been moved to alternate bases in the days since the strikes, spreading the remaining bomber fleet thinner across more locations, each with its own separate security requirements and support infrastructure. That kind of dispersal does not add protection. It only multiplies the number of places that now need to be defended with the same limited resources. Meanwhile, engineering and repair crews have reportedly been brought in from other regional installations to address runway and apron damage, pulling technical manpower away from bases that may need it just as urgently in the weeks ahead. The psychological cost inside the Russian military establishment is harder to quantify but no less real. Engels 2 was never simply a runway. It was a symbol of the reach and permanence of Russia's nuclear-capable strategic aviation, the kind of installation senior officers pointed to as proof that the war's costs stayed safely contained to the front line and to Ukrainian soil. That symbol now sits with a still smoldering fuel depot and damaged dispersal areas, photographed from space by anyone with access to commercial satellite imagery. Maintaining crew morale and operational confidence at a base that has just demonstrated its own vulnerability is not a problem solved by relocating a handful of aircraft. Strategically, this fits the same doctrine Ukraine has applied against fuel depots, shipyards, and refineries elsewhere in the war, simply extended to its most symbolically important target yet. Identify an asset the enemy considers untouchable. Wait until recon, since confirms a predictable, high-value concentration. Strike the fuel, the aircraft, and the detection systems in the same narrow window so that no single repair effort can be prioritized over another. Then allow the operational and psychological consequences to compound on their own, without a single additional soldier ever crossing into Russian territory on the ground. Whether Engels 2 can fully restore its former role as an untouchable rear base for Russia's strategic bombers is now a genuinely open question, and not one Moscow can resolve simply by moving aircraft to a different runway. Every alternate base carries the same long-term exposure once Ukraine's demonstrated strike range and targeting intelligence catch up to it, and Engels 2 was supposed to be the one location that reach could never reach. Instead, the smoke over Saratov Oblast looks like the newest chapter in a pattern that has already reshaped how Russia thinks about the safety of its rear areas, from Black Sea ports to now, unmistakably, its own strategic airfields deep in the interior. The political ripple effects are also starting to surface beyond the base's perimeter. Regional officials in Saratov Oblast, an area that had largely avoided the direct wartime disruptions, felt closer to the front, are reportedly facing new pressure to explain how strikes penetrated this far into Russian territory without earlier warning. Local residents near the base have described hearing extended air raid alerts and explosions over multiple nights in a row, an unfamiliar experience for a region that had spent most of the war treating the conflict as something happening somewhere else. That shift in public perception, from a distant war to one that can reach an ordinary provincial city, tends to matter more to a government's long-term stability than any single military asset lost in a single strike. There is also a slower cost building underneath the visible damage, the erosion of the fleet's own maintenance rhythm. Strategic bombers require extensive scheduled servicing between missions, and that servicing depends on stable infrastructure, predictable fuel supply, and technical crews who are not being constantly relocated. Reports from the region suggest maintenance crews are now being shuffled between bases on short notice to cover gaps left by the dispersal, a pattern that tends to produce exactly the kind of mechanical shortcuts and delayed inspections that erode a fleet's readiness over months rather than days. A burned fuel tank can be rebuilt in weeks. A disrupted maintenance cycle for aircraft this complex takes considerably longer to fully repair, and it rarely shows up in a single dramatic headline. None of this means Russia's bomber fleet is finished as a fighting force, and no serious analyst is claiming otherwise. Aircraft can be relocated, fuel depots can eventually be rebuilt, and radar coverage can be patched with equipment pulled from elsewhere. But every one of those fixes costs time, resources, and institutional attention that Russia would otherwise be spending on the front line itself, and each fix now has to be repeated at whichever base absorbs the fleet next. That compounding drag, rather than any single dramatic strike, is the actual target of this kind of campaign. So the real question isn't whether Russia can patch the runway and refill the fuel tanks at Engels 2. It's whether Moscow has any base left that its own strategic aviation fleet can consider genuinely safe. Now that distance alone has been proven not to be enough. What do you think? Has Ukraine just closed the last real safe haven for Russia's bomber fleet? Or does Moscow still have options left to rebuild that sense of security? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more breakdowns like this the moment they happen, make sure you're subscribed.